Hi everyone, thank you for your patience, just giving people a couple of minutes to join the webinar today. So we know we've got a lot of people signed up, but I think now we're 3 minutes in, let's get started, and it's absolutely fine if more people trickle in and join us. Um, Hello and thank you for joining. I'm Sophie. I'm the Principal Communication Strategist at Frameworks UK, and we've been partnering with JRF and the Nationwide Foundation for a number of years now to identify ways that we can all communicate about housing in the UK to help improve the people's understanding, the quality of discussion and debate, and ultimately lead to positive changes in our housing system. Now, you might well have joined one of our previous webinars, or you might have come to a workshop with us. And all of this work has been looking at how we can tell a new story about homes in the UK. You might be new to all of this. That's absolutely fine and welcome if that's the case. Today, we're going to focus on how to frame data specifically and how to do that in ways that build understanding and support for various changes and reforms that would ensure everyone has a decent and affordable place to call home. We'll also look at how we might make the economic case for certain housing policies within today's webinar as well. Just a few bits of housekeeping before we get started. We are recording today's session, and we also have recordings of our previous webinars, which are available on JRF's YouTube channel and also on the Frameworks UK website if you'd like to catch up. You'll notice that you're all muted, you'll have your cameras off, and it'll be that way for the duration of the webinar today, just due to the very large number of people joining to keep things smooth and simple. But just to reassure you, that's totally normal. We won't be sharing a PDF of the slides, but even better than that, we have lots of resources that you can access, and we'll be popping links to those in the chat so you can grab them as the webinar goes on. There'll also be a follow-up email after the webinar with some helpful resources. My colleague Maria will be joining us a little bit later, and Natalie from JRF is also here in the background managing our Q&A today. So if you have a question, please do pop it in the Q&A box. I'm going to be speaking for roughly 40 minutes, then we'll move into that Q&A and use that remaining time to answer any questions you might have. You can also upvote other people's questions if you see something in the Q&A where you think, I'd also like the answer to that. And lastly, feel free to add your organisation's name to your Zoom name, as it's just really great for us to be able to see where people are joining us from when we get to taking your questions. But without further ado, housekeeping all done, let's get started. First, a little bit about Frameworks UK for anyone who's perhaps not met us before. We are a not-for-profit and we specialise in evidence-based communication strategies to shift hearts and minds. So essentially, we help charities and other mission-driven organisations to communicate about social issues in ways that are going to be helpful for creating progress. We do this through practical guidance, all underpinned by our framing research. Now, Frameworks research is all about understanding how people think about different social issues. So our research tells us not just what people think, but why they think it. And then we use that knowledge to develop and test different communications approaches that will be helpful to create the lasting change that we want to see. We work with our partners to change communications to create that change. Here are some of the organisations we've worked with in the UK recently, and we mostly focus on issues around children and families, homes, poverty and health. So we have a really solid research base, which I'm drawing from for today's session. All of these resources on screen are available on the Frameworks UK website if you'd like to dig into any of the research in a bit more detail. In each case, our research has included both qualitative and quantitative testing through large-scale representative surveys, interviews, and peer discourse sessions, which are a type of focus group where we test different ways of framing communications in a conversational setting. I'll also be drawing from some other studies which have focused particularly on the use of data in communications. And all this to say, the communications principles, the tips, the guidance that I'm sharing with you today all come from a really robust evidence base. But rather than doing a deep dive into research today, I'd like us to really focus on what we can do with those insights, what they really mean for framing communications about homes in the UK. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to have a quick intro to what framing is, why it matters, and particularly why framing data matters. We'll look at how people think about homes, because that's very important, understanding how people think before we then do our reframing. Then we'll look at some tips for framing data effectively, and also tips for how to best make the economic case for different housing policies. Then we'll move into the Q&A. So do pop any questions in the Q&A as we go through so we can pick them up at the end. So first of all, what is framing? Why does it matter? Framing is the choices we make about what ideas we share and how we share them. So this includes what we emphasise, how we might explain an issue, and also what we might leave unsaid. And framing matters because these choices can lead to really radical changes in how people think, feel, and act. Now, all of us are framing all of the time. You can't really not frame your communications, but the difference between that and when we make those decisions deliberately, ideally backed up by evidence, is that we can just make these framing decisions consciously and with a lot more confidence that our communications are actually landing as we intend them to, that we're being heard in the way that we want to be heard and understood in the way that we want to be understood. If you've joined or watched one of our previous webinars, you might recognise this classic experiment in which the researchers wanted to look at the impact of framing on the choice between different medical treatments. So respondents were asked to choose between surgery and radiotherapy treatment for lung cancer. Some of the respondents in this experiment were patients, some of them were medics, and some of them were students. One group were told there's a 90% chance of survival following surgery, and a second group were told there's a 10% chance of mortality following surgery. And it's the same probability, it's just framed differently in terms of survival or mortality. And these were the results. The survival frame led to a substantially higher preference for surgery. And what's really surprising here is that the framing effect was no less pronounced for the medics who were involved in the study. So even people with a really solid understanding of the treatments and the probability. So this shows us that not only does how we frame make a difference, but regardless of knowledge and expertise, how people were primed to think with this framing changed their understanding. So this is one example of how framing and framing data matters. So the reason I'm sharing it again, even for those of you that joined us previously, is let's remember this is a classic example of how the way we frame our data leads to substantially different results. It shapes how issues are seen and understood. So our research starts by seeking to understand what are the mindsets that people hold on a given issue, because we want to know not just what people think, essentially attitudes, which can come and go. We want to dig that little bit deeper to understand how people are thinking and reasoning when it comes to different issues. Mindsets are deep patterns of thinking that shape how we all understand the world. They are implicit, they are shared, and they are enduring. And they're activated by the things that we see and hear, whether that's stories we read in the paper, TV that we might watch, the conversations that we have, all of those narratives around us. And framing works when we're able to navigate these mindsets, when we're able to find ways of framing that are going to strengthen the more helpful mindsets that are going to be helpful in achieving positive social change, and also avoiding the ones that are going to be unproductive. If you think about what I said earlier, framing is also what we leave unsaid. Also, we might leave something unsaid so that we're not going to trigger an unhelpful mindset. So this is how we started our work with JRF and Nationwide. First of all, understanding how do people think about homes in the UK. And our research surfaced some ways of thinking which were identified as obstacles which we need to overcome in our communications. Those of you who have joined us before will be familiar with these, but let's have a quick recap because it's always good to remember where might our communications be taking people. So first of all, there's this quite entrenched idea that housing is first and foremost a source of investment and wealth. So this idea that we ideally want to own our home so that we can have this kind of nest egg, essentially for the future. And when we are so sort of preoccupied with this idea of owning our home, and this is something which is very much triggered by communications talking about, for example, the housing market or getting on the property ladder. The problem with that, although it's not necessarily problematic in itself, is that it can mean that this overwhelming focus on owning our home means that rented and social housing is thought of as more temporary. It's maybe thought of as a sort of stepping stone along the way to home ownership. And then that problem with thinking of other ways of living in a home as being temporary is that people don't necessarily realize how important it is to ensure that rented accommodation, that social homes are good quality, and that they are available, they're affordable. We tend to see people sort of reasoning, well, a roof over your head is sufficient in the meantime, for example. We saw that people, while they were quite clear on the negative impacts that not having a decent home might well have on your life, it was less front of mind, sort of thinking about that really positive impact of having a decent and affordable place to call home. And instead, people tended to reason more that kind of a decent home being sort of a neutral state of being rather than really seeing the value that adds to our lives. People were able to recognise there are inequalities in our housing system, but when it came to thinking about how those inequalities have come about, they tended to think it's just the way it is. It's just natural. That's just the way that system works. It's imperfect, but it's what we have and it's what we have to live with, which obviously is not that helpful when we're wanting to think about how could we improve our housing system? How could we make it work better for everybody? The next mindset, which we saw, and it's not a surprise because this is one that we see on, I think, pretty much every issue we've done research into, was individualism. So individualism is this idea that how we do in life is really just down to our own sort of our own choices, our own hard work. And this showed up in housing as people thinking, well, if somebody's not living in a place which is sort of meeting their needs, they just need to work harder, they need to earn more to work themselves out of that, instead of thinking about those more kind of systemic changes to our housing system that would help many more people. And lastly, again, a mindset, our old nemesis that comes up again and again, this mindset of fatalism. So this is the sense that people recognised we are facing a housing crisis. They recognised the size of the issue, but kind of felt like there's almost no point in trying to fix it because the problem is just too big to solve. So obviously that's a barrier to change. We need to instead show how we can change it. We also found much more productive ways of thinking that we can bolster with the right framing, that we can bring to the fore, rather than triggering these less helpful ideas, which tend to be more front of mind. And there are plenty of ways that we can fill in the gaps in people's understanding to help with this. We've covered those in our previous webinars. We will touch upon some of that today again. But why are we focusing on data in this session? It's because data can be interpreted in different ways. And when we don't consider how we frame our data, we can leave it open to interpretation based on those most dominant mindsets. As much as we might like it to, data doesn't speak for itself. Now, to illustrate this, let me tell you about a study looking into something called motivated reasoning, and it was conducted with a group of Danish politicians. Half of the politicians were given anonymised data about school performance, and the politicians in this group interpreted the data correctly. They were able to identify that School A was outperforming School B. The other half of the politicians were told which school was a state school, which was a private school. And then they were asked about the performance of those schools. And this is a very political issue in Denmark, something that people have strong feelings about. And I think you can all guess what happened. The politicians in the group who were told which school was which misinterpreted the data to fit their existing political leaning. So those who supported state schools argued that the data showed the state school was doing better. Those who were keen on private schools said the data showed the private school was doing better. Now, you might be thinking maybe they just needed more data. Maybe they just needed better data. So they tested this in the study as well. They repeated the experiment with first 3 times and then 5 times the data. But the result was that the politicians doubled down. More data did not make a difference. Now, this illustrates a wider point, which is that if someone doesn't already agree with us, facts and statistics tend to just bounce off. People will make up their own stories that fit, and they might not always be the stories we wanted to tell. Now, we are all susceptible to this. In fact, the more educated we are, the more likely we are to do it. When we encounter data that contradicts a belief that's linked to our identity, we will seek to discredit it, to ignore it, or to misinterpret that information. Conventional thinking is that if we haven't landed our point with numerical data, maybe we should present it in an alternative format with charts, graphs, tables. And then if that doesn't work, maybe we should provide some more evidence, which will ultimately lead to people just really understanding the point we're making, having that great epiphany. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Data alone is very unlikely to achieve this change, but we can make choices in how we frame our data, which will greatly strengthen our communications. An example from some previous research we did with JRF on how to talk about poverty. Now, here's what happened when we tested arguments based on the number of people living in poverty versus the same data framed with the value of compassion, which is a framing element that we found in our research to be helpful for shifting people's thinking. Now, there was a control group represented by that solid black line along 0, and anything above this represents an improvement, an increase in support for the idea that poverty matters, that we have a responsibility to act, and that action will make a difference. And as you can see, those red bars there, the argument based on data alone effectively had the same result as saying nothing at all. Whereas the data combined with an appeal to compassion led to a significant shift in people's responses for the better. In a nutshell, if you take one thing away from today, it's that we need to use data to support our story, but don't expect it to tell the story for us. So we're going to use this session to explore some of the ways we can best frame our data so it's supporting our communications as we intend it to. I also like this analogy, which is basically to say that data is helpful content. It can be a good building block, but it doesn't tell the story by itself. We need to do that. So let's look at what we can do. First of all, we need to really think about leading with the story that we want to tell. And as we've just covered, this is because numbers don't speak for themselves. So we need to lead with that story and support that with data, not the other way around. Now, in a nutshell, this is a story we want to tell about homes, a story that we found to shift people's thinking and build support for the solutions that we need to see in our housing system. We need to shift thinking away from housing being a consumer good first and foremost, and towards homes as being essential to a decent life, a story about health, not wealth. And we also need our story to have solutions and explanation at its heart to really counter that fatalistic idea that the current housing system is just the way it is and can't be improved, and to show how it both can and must be changed. So you can think of this as that overarching story that we're wanting to lead with. And these are the communications principles that we can use to do that, to frame our story and to frame our data. You can dig into these more by taking a look at our toolkit and catching up on our introduction webinar that we've done in the past. But in brief, quick recap, we want to really talk about how homes are a source of health and well-being, to really show why it matters that we make it possible for everybody to live in a decent, affordable home. We can use an explanatory metaphor. We found this helpful metaphor is talking about home as the foundation for a decent life, to be really helpful for building that understanding and support. When we're thinking about what sort of shared values we might use to frame our communications, invoking people's sense of moral responsibility is really key here to collectivize the issue and sort of show why this is something we all need to act on and we all have a stake in. We've also looked at what's the best tone we can use when we're framing our comms, and we found that combining a sort of critical tone that's really looking at how we got here and who's responsible, but combining that with explanations of solutions is really key. And lastly, a bit less relevant to data today, but remember, if you're using individual stories, always put them in context. So as I say, much more on this in the toolkit, but do keep these in mind as we go through the session today. Let's start with a cautionary tale for what can happen when we don't lead with the story we want to tell, when we use naked numbers and don't dress our data. So For context, this was when Jamie Oliver was campaigning for reducing sugar in drinks, calling for a change in our food system, a systemic change. And he went out with this stat about how 26,000 primary age children were admitted to hospital last year because of tooth decay caused by sugar. Now, that's the stat he went out with, but how did people fill in the gaps? Here's the tweet that popped up first, right underneath the post. The first response that most people saw: neglectful parents, you forgot that part. And there were much more comments like this as well. Essentially, what had happened is people had defaulted to the most dominant mindset of individual blame, which is so prevalent when it comes to thinking about children's health and food. So this is a cautionary tale about how we need to dress our data with cues that reframe the issue and tell the story that we intend to, because without this, naked numbers like this can reinforce existing dominant beliefs about what the issue is, who's responsible, and what can be done. So you can think of this as dressing your data, no naked numbers. You can think of this as really leading with the story you want to tell. It's important to think about where data could take people based on what we know about the mindsets that people hold on homes. So, for example, looking at this first stat here, nearly 250,000 people are living in temporary accommodation. Without some context around that, without leading with the story that we want to tell, there are a few mindsets this could trigger. It could trigger fatalism with people thinking, that's a really big number. What are we going to do about it? You could leave people thinking, well, I don't really know what's wrong with that. They maybe don't know what temporary accommodation is. They might think, well, it sounds like at least people have a roof over their head. The second stat, the one about the average house price in the UK. Now, this could just trigger that idea again of individualism, that people just need to save up to buy a home because we're focusing here on buying. It could be triggering that idea of the sort of commodification of housing. And also, there's no sense of here of whether that's affordable or unaffordable, no context such as how that might be difficult to afford if you're on an average wage in the UK. So a few things there, a few ways we might lead with a better story to frame that. And thirdly, the last stat here about how the government said it will spend 30 billion on housing support this year. Again, this could trigger fatalism, the idea that that sounds like an awful lot of money. It could possibly even trigger blame with us thinking, or a sort of us versus them mindset of, why is that support going to people who need housing support when I'm also struggling to buy a place, for example. So it's just always good to think, where could this data take somebody? Think about how you could frame it better, which we'll get to in just a second. But I'm not saying to avoid using data like this. I'm just saying that we need to frame it, really think about where people might go, and then think about how you can take them where you want to take them. So when we're communicating something using a stat, we basically need to ask ourselves these questions. What do we need our numbers to do? If your answer to this is build awareness, really think about awareness of what and what else are you doing in your communications to make sure you land that point. Think about what problem you need the stat to illustrate and whether you're actually spelling out that problem as well. Think about what solution you might want to point towards, whether that solution is explicit, because without this, people will fall back on existing mindsets and the solutions that follow from those. Those might not be the solutions that you intended. And lastly, don't feel that you have to throw all of your numbers at it. Select and reject numbers strategically to best serve your point. So an example here of how we could frame a stat by really leading with the story that we want to tell, and by drawing on those tested framing principles in order to do that. So here, instead of just saying almost 1.3 million people in England are on the waiting list for a social home, we've dressed the data. We've started by establishing why this matters, by saying our homes are the foundation for our lives. We all need a decent quality, affordable home to support our health and well-being. And we've talked about how people need a place where they can put down roots and thrive. So we've told a story around that number instead of just leaving the number to do the heavy lifting. The number then adds a sense of scale to our story, but it's not being relied upon to tell the whole story. Another example of successfully using numbers that support the story that we're really trying to tell, really leading with that story. As we've covered, making the connection between our homes and our health is a very helpful way to reframe the conversation away from a house as an asset, the idea of home equals wealth to home equals health. So these are some examples of stats from Shelter that I think are really great examples of how we can select numbers strategically to support our story instead of thinking, what data do we have and then how do we reframe it? We can think of it this way around instead, thinking, what data do we need to support that story we're trying to tell? So here as a result, the health frame, that idea of our homes being pivotal to our health and well-being, is really baked into the communications. Talking about the number of renters who are saying that their home is harming their health, talking about how people in poor housing are suffering ill health due to legal delays. So here, those numbers are baked in. There was still, and there were, other things in the communications to add further context, but it's a great idea of really being strategic with the numbers that we use. Another way that we can make sure data is supporting our story is to find ways to make it easier to understand. Now, this isn't just about accessibility, which is, of course, very important. It's also about making our numbers more tangible and more memorable. Numbers work best when they're placed in a familiar or relatable context. They can provide the sense of the scope of a problem, the scale of a solution, or the credibility of an analysis. So for example, if we're talking about how many social homes need to be built, we could put that number in context by saying how many social homes were actually built last year and how many were lost. So then we're giving a sense of scale and context there. Social maths is another helpful way of framing numbers. This is where we can make a comparison between a number and something which is much more familiar on a relatable scale. So this is especially helpful for very large numbers, which are hard for us to really grasp. For example, if we were to just talk about 2 million households, but people have no idea how many households there are in the UK, then we need to do something to make that number more relatable. Could we instead say 1 in 10 households, or compare that to the population size of a particular city, for example? Something just more relatable. And where possible, try to simplify numbers. So it's much better to say 1 in 3 than 33.33, for example. Using sort of 1 in 3 is generally more sort of graspable and understandable than percentages. So do that where we can and simplify decimal places where we can. It's okay to say over 35, over 50% rather than 51%, for example. Let's look at an example of putting numbers in context and looking at a different issue area just for the sake of this example. So this stat here, the tobacco industry spends 12.5 billion a year promoting smoking. Without context, it's hard to know what this really means. Is that a lot? The USA is a big country after all. We have nothing to compare this to. So this is where we could add some context. Something like this. The tobacco industry spends more money promoting smoking in a week than the entire federal government spends on preventing smoking in a year. Now we have some context. It highlights an important power imbalance also in doing that. And it also leads us to think more about what might need to be done, such as curbing marketing spending or increasing funding for preventing smoking. So it's telling more of a story, as well as giving that context of what does that number actually mean. Next, an example of how we can use comparison. So again, looking at a different issue area, this stat says cars take up too much space on our roads, and even a small one takes up about 150 square feet of road space. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't really envisage 150 square feet of road space. But this comparison helps me to do so. That's 7.5 times the space used by a person on a bicycle or a bus. Now, as well as making that number more relatable with this social maths, it's also starting to point towards a solution. I see what's really being said here. It's trying to make the case for alternative modes of transport. And another way to bring this to life, you could make it visual. You could really, this is still using data, but it's telling the story visually and in a way which really is getting to the heart of what we're saying here, that we need more ability for people to cycle, people to use public transport to free up congestion on our roads. Now let's look at an example coming back to homes and how you'd actually perhaps use this in some of your comms. Our before here is 4.4% of children in London are living in temporary accommodation. So first of all, we could make this percentage easier to understand. We could say over 1 in 25 children in London are living in temporary accommodation. Better still, we could compare this to something tangible. We could say that's the equivalent of at least one child in an average classroom. All of a sudden, it's more tangible. I'm actually picturing children instead of a percentage, and it's bringing it home what that really means. You know, one child in every classroom, that's a lot. Now we've looked at a couple of tips there for framing data. Often what we want to use data for is to make the economic case for different policies. And we're asked a lot how best to do this and should we do this when we're communicating about homes. There are a few things to be aware of to help us to frame this sort of argument effectively. First, let's get a flavour of the mindsets people hold about the economy. So when people are thinking about how the economy works, people tend to think of the economy as being about money, always and only about money. This obscures aspects of the economy that can't be tied to the direct exchange of money. So that's the first thing to be aware of. Secondly, people tend to think of the economy as a container. It's a pot of money, ideally a full pot, with more people contributing to the pot than taking out of it. This drives a powerful sense of fairness and concern over those contributing and those draining when people think about the economy. Next, mysterious forces. So essentially, there is a cognitive hole here, a gap in understanding around how the economy actually works. This is largely because people have not been given repeated exposure to usable ways of making connections and understanding the processes by which the economy does work. So it's understandable. And people, as a result, tend to think of the economy as just being, it is what it is. Kind of sense of it's just a kind of natural state of being. It's like gravity or the weather. And this is a mindset which is routinely fed in the way that the economy and changes in the economy are described in the media and culture. For example, using weather metaphors when talking about the state of the economy. People often tend to think that the system is rigged, that the economy is essentially being rigged by a cluster of powerful individuals rather than a system of interconnected institutions as well. When it comes to solutions, there's generally a lack of them in people's thinking. People tend to struggle to see how the economy could be changed, which is likely to spark both fatalism and also sense of individualism and zero-sum thinking. This idea of, well, I've just got to do what works for me, instead of thinking, how could we redesign the economy to work for everybody? So this is why we very often test for the effects of framing an issue in economic terms. And across many issues, we see that it can actually backfire. So we often advise against leading with economic arguments. But is this the case when it comes to homes? This is an example of what happened when we tested some different issue frames to really establish what's the best way of talking about social homes. So essentially, you could say that social homes are at their core about reducing poverty. You could say that they're first and foremost about supporting our economy or about improving our country's health. There are, of course, many dimensions to this issue, but we wanted to find out which issue is the most helpful one to lead with to really open up how people think about social homes. And when we tested these three different issue frames, we found that the poverty and health issue frames were both effective in increasing people's support for policies to build more social housing, whereas making the economic argument did not make a difference when used alone. So what does this mean for our story? What I'd say this means is that talking about social homes in terms of economic benefits alone doesn't boost support at scale for building more of them. So while an economic argument may form part of our communications, we just can't rely on it as our silver bullet. So if you want to include an economic argument for homes, there are some ways that some things that we can do to help strengthen our case, rather than just relying on the economic argument to do all of the heavy lifting. Use it to support your story, not to tell the whole story. Think of it as part of the story, not the story. And there are other framing elements we found to be much more effective for building that wholesale support. For example, the benefits to people's health being really, first and foremost, the best ways of framing this issue to build support. Consider sequencing. So make the economic argument after first establishing the why, the true value of home to people's lives, the benefits to people's health and well-being, that idea of it being a foundation for our lives. Because what we say first primes people's thinking. Let's start with something that we've seen to be really helpful for building support, and then bring in that economic argument. And thirdly, think about your audience. For some, including the economic argument will be essential. For example, talking to policymakers who are saying, show me the money. But that's not the case across the board. So really think about, when will it best serve you? When are you best just leading with other ways of framing the issue? A good example of how you can weave in the economic argument into your story without relying on it here. Now, this is taken from an email from Shelter. It was all about their research with the National Housing Federation, which was looking at how basically assessing the economic benefits of building more social homes. Now, see here how they've established the value to our society, to our health. They've used a tested metaphor of a stable foundation. And they did this right at the top of the email to frame the conversation before going into the detail of the economic benefits. They say, before we talk about money, let's clear something up. Social rent homes have a huge benefit for society, from bettering health to education, building community, and providing a stable foundation for families to truly thrive. So that's a great way of, first off, really saying this is what it's about. Now let's talk about the economy. Great example of sequencing. A final thought and tip to check if we are really framing our data is to look at your piece of communications and think, if you were to take the data out, would your communication still tell your story? If your answer to that is no, consider how you could dress the data better. Consider how you could lead with the frames that we've tried and tested, how you could add context, how you could add explanation, and really just beef up your communications so you're not leaving that data to try and do the heavy lifting, because chances are it might not. Here's one of our favourite slides to end on, which will be familiar to those of us that have been with us through this series of webinars. But let's remember why it's so important that we're all drawing on the same framing principles. And it's because often communications, messaging on an issue can look a bit like what's on screen. So lots of different people sharing different things in different ways. And if you're listening from the outside, it's really hard to hear a clear message or signal through all of that noise and to draw any kind of consistent understanding that changes the way you think about the issue. Data alone is not going to change that. But when we draw on the same frames, the same communications principles, it can start to feel much more like this. So this isn't about everyone saying the same thing in the same way, but it is about using framing to support the same overarching story so that we can shift understanding in the same direction and make sure that those crucial messages and the understanding that we're trying to create do take hold. Now, I've spoken for almost exactly 40 minutes, as I promised. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen so that we can get into the Q&A and see if you have any questions for me.
Thanks, Sophie, so much for that. That was really great to hear. We've already got a few questions coming in, so I think I'll jump in straight away. But do keep your questions coming, guys. So one of the questions that's come in, and I think you touched upon this, Sophie, but I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more, is about audiences. So if we're targeting politicians rather than the public, does it work to make the economic case?
Great, and this is a very popular question that we're often asked, what do I do about my particular audiences? There's a few ways I could answer this. I would say, first of all, the way that we do our research at Frameworks is we're looking at what are those framing principles that are going to work best across the whole population, so sort of moving many people rather than a few. Having said that, if you have specific audience insights, you can always layer that on top of a framing strategy. So sort of starting at that level of what is my overarching story I'm saying to everybody, and then think, how could I layer on some additional insights of what works best for this audience? What I'd always encourage you to do is, when thinking about that kind of audience segmentation, still don't go against your overall framing strategy. You don't want to have that kind of like discord between your communications, because as much as we try and target things, you know, you might speak to one audience who speaks to another, and you're going to want to make sure that the best framing is making it through to any audience. Second of all, politicians are, we might forget this sometimes, but they are just people. So they share the same mindsets that we all hold on these issues, and still the same watch-outs do apply. So I would still say, sort of as we've covered in that sort of last part of the session today, lead with something like the importance to health, the foundation for our lives, as part of making that economic argument, sort of before you bring it in, to first sort of start in that place we've established as being helpful mindset, and then build on that with economic case if it's for an audience such as policymakers, where you know that they want to know what it's going to cost and whether this will work economically.
Thanks, Sophie. That's great. Another question that's just come in is there any advice for taking sort of quite negative data that's perhaps showing things around affordability for first-time buyers or the number of people in temporary accommodation, and using that to kind of tell a more positive story or a story about solutions? Is there anything you can say on that?
Yeah, so I think this kind of comes down to, you know, often we've got sort of stats which would very much we think of as maybe sort of raising the awareness of a problem, and I think the best way to, like as I sort of said, within one of the things we really need to build on when it comes to that kind of meta story about homes is still showing what do we do about it. So I think this is a classic example of that stat is maybe part of the story, but you absolutely need to follow it up with what can we do about it, and really thinking, I think, here about how you want your scale of solution to match your scale of problem. So if you've got a stat which is really sort of showing how big an issue this is, you then need to follow that up with quite an ambitious solution, which then sort of flows and makes sense of like, oh, I can see how that's going to fix that. If we have quite a sort of big stat and then the solution is something which maybe feels quite tiny, we're probably not going to overcome that sense of fatalism, which we know to be so front of mind. So it's really thinking, pair that problem with the solution, make it proportionate.
Great, thank you, Sophie. Another question that's come in, and I think we get this one a lot, so I think it's a good one to ask, is that are there any tips or ways that we can persuade colleagues perhaps who are a bit nervous about editorializing data, who think that the data should just speak for itself?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, I would say point them towards this webinar, maybe as a starting point. We've got lots of good evidence-based examples of where unfortunately that isn't the case. But I would say, you know, it's partly our job as people who work with data to translate it. And that's what we're talking about here, is really don't just leave the data by itself, because any sort of good data analysis involves interpretation. And we're just doing that further step of actually then communicating that well and using framing to do it. You know, if we're having a data-laden report, for example, of course it's going to have an XX summary. That's essentially doing a similar kind of job here of thinking, what are the numbers I'm really pulling out and what do they actually mean? So I think of this as a translation job as much as anything else, and perhaps that would be a bit more sort of comforting to people who feel like, well, surely the data can speak for itself. Just think about that kind of translation job and in using good communications to do that.
That's great, thank you, Sophie. I think there's a few different questions coming in now, which kind of relate to selecting which data you should share. So either, you know, which data is going to be most authentic, which data is going to really push people forwards. Is there anything you can say about the kind of stats we might want to use to help us make our case?
So I guess I would sort of go back to what we found about how people really think about housing, and where there's maybe some gaps that we need to fill in, or where there's, you know, particular framing principles we'd recommend and how that could be supported with data. So one of those earlier examples I shared, some of those communications from Shelter, where they had data that was all about health, the impacts on our health from our homes. That I think is great data because, as I said, the framing is really sort of baked in there. It shows we're talking about health here, and we've found that talking about health in relation to homes is helpful for building that support and understanding. I'd also say, you know, a lot of data, and this is not unique to when we're talking about housing, tends to be about the sort of scale of a problem, and, you know, the almost sort of doom and gloom sort of figures. But maybe let's think about how we could also use data that tells that story of solutions a bit more, about how actually like there's lots of great ideas out there of how we could fix things, and think about how data might be helpful for showing that, for example, sort of using that to really break down the feasibility of solutions, perhaps. But yeah, just really thinking, what's the story first, and then what data do you maybe need to help you tell it? But then also being prepared to think sometimes data isn't the thing that's going to make the difference, and that's okay. And that there's other ways that you can make your point through, for example, backing this up with strong storytelling and giving really good examples of how things are sort of working in practice and could be replicated. There's so many tools in our toolbox. Data is just one part of that. And if you don't feel that the data is supporting your story, you don't have to use it.
Thanks, Sophie. That's really helpful. One slightly more specific kind of comment and question that we've had, which it might be interesting to hear your thoughts on, is someone's asked, we have a significant issue with data that we share around rough sleeping, then resulting in a backlash with lots of sort of anti-immigration or anti-asylum commentary in relation to that. And I just wondered if there's anything you could say about how we deal with the sharing data and kind of it perhaps provoking an unintended consequence, and what should we be thinking about to try and avoid that from happening?
And this is something which has been coming up a lot when we've been working with partners in this space. And I'll say firstly that I think further research is needed to really look at how do we best frame that aspect of the issue and sort of dealing with that kind of backlash specifically around sort of anti-immigrant sentiment. So that to one side, I think there's still some things that we can do to help with this. Really starting by before sort of perhaps sharing those stats, thinking about how you can collectivize the issue. And so this is where I would look at maybe appealing to a value that we've found to be helpful. So when talking more generally about homes, we found really appealing to that sense of moral responsibility, making that kind of common case for change before then bringing in an aspect of the problem and a solution to that could be one way to help sort of mitigate against some of that backlash. I'd say as well, specifically, we're talking about homelessness and rough sleeping. We've done previous research on homelessness and found there that relying on this, using this value of interdependence, this idea of how, you know, when one of us suffers, all of us suffer. When one of us thrives, we all thrive as a society, is the value that I'd most recommend really leaning on if we're talking about rough sleeping, because what we really need to do there is humanize that figure and really remind people that we're talking about people and people in a shared society that we all live in. So for that particularly, I'd recommend going back to actually our previous research that we carried out with Crisis, looking at framing homelessness to best deal with some of that potential backlash.
Thanks, that's really helpful. We've just had a question come in, which I think is an interesting one, which is around, I guess, using data and being data-led. Well, what happens when perhaps some of the data or case studies don't quite match with the story we're wanting to tell? Is there anything we should be kind of thinking about in that way?
It's an interesting one. I feel it's one where we're like, what data are we talking about, or what stories are we talking about? Because it's one where I think the context is probably really key here. Of like, actually, if that data isn't matching up with the sort of story you wanted to tell, is that because the data is actually telling us a story that we then need to sort of look at and problem solve and think about what that really means for not just our communications, but our whole sort of strategy and how we might be thinking about an issue. So it sounds like a cop-out, but I think it sounds like it slightly depends. But if this person has any follow-up to that, then do pop it in, because we might be able to dig into that a little bit more. But that's my first thought. When it comes to sort of the stories that we're hearing, maybe not quite matching up with, again, what we're looking at, I think this is maybe where I'd think about how, you know, no one individual story should be left to do the heavy lifting either. That actually, when it comes to sort of stories of lived experience in relation to housing and homelessness, it's about representing a sort of breadth of experience and what is that telling us, rather than relying on one story to necessarily be representative of everything that we're trying to say.
Perfect, that's really helpful. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on what we can do when we're perhaps trying to grab the attention of the media or kind of really get people to listen to what we have to say, and those audiences who often want to use perhaps just data in a slightly unhelpful way, and what we can do to kind of overcome some of that.
Yeah, and I think what this is probably getting at is that sense of often we feel like, or what can tend to happen is that media will latch more onto those big doom and gloom kind of numbers, that kind of, yeah, the crisis, and the data that backs that up. And so I'd say this is about being really mindful when we're doing things like our press releases of, yeah, just really thinking about what numbers might get picked out, what context can you add to those numbers, and where might you actually just need to be a bit careful about what numbers that you put in there, so that you're not sending a press release and all that's really picked out is, look how big and bad this problem is. We could do a whole session about best ways of sort of really hooking media with other things, so that we're not just sort of relying on that kind of big crisis message. But absolutely, that's one part of this. And I'd say the other part of this is really thinking, and I keep fangirling over this shelter example, but those health statistics that, looking at the sort of impact on renters who were sort of waiting for renting reform to come through and the impacts on their health, that was an excellent, within an excellent article in The Guardian, which all came from this research and those stats where health was baked in. There was also this brought in lived experience from people as part of that story. So it was multifaceted, and it wasn't just about those numbers, but those numbers absolutely backed up that bigger story that was being told. So I would say that's an example of, I assume what Shelter did is they thought, what's the story that we want to tell? What data do we need to back it up? And that data that backed it up wasn't just about the scale of a problem. It was actually about building understanding about how our homes impact our health.
Great, that's really helpful, Sophie. Another question that's got quite a few upvotes, so I wanted to ask these around tips for kind of trying to show data that overlaps. So in this example, they're talking about how kind of multiple deprivations might affect someone's lives in terms of homes and health. And I guess, how do we tell that connected story is that kind of bigger question.
Yeah, so I think this is a classic example of actually where the data is telling us something, but then how we might communicate it. For most audiences, it might not be about just being like, here's our data. And actually, instead, we do need to tell a story. And this is where I'd really recommend thinking about how you can break down that story step by step, talk about sort of cause and effect, how one thing is maybe leading to another, is leading to another, and also still ending that with what's the solution here. So this is where you could really tell a story about how, as it says in the question, sort of multiple deprivations interact, how that can make it much harder for somebody, how it can impact certain groups much more than others, and therefore why we might need sort of targeted solutions to address that, for example, to really tell that complete story. But I think in this case, it's probably about breaking down sort of how does this happen and telling that story, rather than necessarily just presenting back the data to tell that story. It feels like the data has told you the story that you then need to tell.
That's great. I think that's really helpful. And one other question that's been upticked, and this may be more of a political question than just a data question, but what's been asked is it a good idea to frame the data in a way that puts pressure on decision makers, i.e. showing perhaps where government failures, using their own data to show that they're part of the problem? Do we have a thought on kind of whether data like that can be a helpful part of the story?
So it's interesting because when it comes to housing specifically, we did find that sort of thinking about who is responsible is helpful. Because it's helpful for breaking down that sort of sense of like, well, the housing system isn't great, but it is what it is. Essentially, you can get into causation and sort of who is responsible for action. This is where I would say take a look at the toolkit, take a look at recommendation 4, sort of how far you might push that kind of critical tone. But sort of highlighting who is responsible for taking action, I think is a good thing, because it doesn't just leave us thinking like, oh, well, housing's bad, hopefully it'll get better. We're actually really talking about how maybe not a great policy or a lack of action has led us here, and therefore what can be done to get us out. Just don't miss out that solution part, and sort of, I guess, sort of offering that kind of olive branch of like, this is what could be done, and now is the time for action, and first year of a new government. This isn't about painting villains. This is about a conversation about responsibility and what we actually can do to improve things. So yeah, that's the sort of way I'd think about doing that.
I think that emphasis there on responsibility and bringing that back to that moral responsibility is really helpful. One other quick question, because I know we're just about at the end, that's just come in, is any advice on how we do this when we're short on space? So if we're compiling something for a social media post, how can we do this quickly to make sure that we're not just sharing statistics that are naked numbers?
And yeah, I think getting this sort of thing right in a short social media post is probably actually like the hardest place, and also the place where we're going to get the most immediate feedback on sort of how it landed. So first of all, acknowledging the challenge there. But I would say really think about sort of what maybe goes in the image, what's going in the caption to support that. Think about as well, actually, if this is something that really does require a bit more context around it, do you actually need to do this in a different format, like a short explainer reel or something, where you can actually bake in the storytelling much more without it being really a lot of stuff to read? So this is where I'd say be quite sort of savvy about how, if you know what you need to say, think about then the format that's going to best support that, so you can get everything that you want to get in there while it still feels digestible and like a good social media post.
Great. I think we're just about at time.
Great.
So do you want to share any final thoughts?
My only final thoughts are just to say that Natalie has popped lots of helpful links and resources in the chat here. I believe these will also be in a follow-up email to you. But for anything sort of talking about housing related, we've got lots and lots of resources, both on JRF's website and also on Frameworks UK website. Search for housing, homes, you'll find lots of helpful things coming up. Yeah, really hope it's been useful. It's been really great to have so many people joining us again, and we will be in touch whenever we've got the next webinar like this lined up and ready for people to sign up for. But for now, thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your days.